Dr. Zora Kingston boarded Liberty Air Flight 509, confident and poised, ready for a routine flight. But when she attempted to sit in her first-class seat, the flight attendant blocked her way, eyes scanning her from head to toe. The attendant's gaze held a familiar judgment, sharp and dismissive, as if it was a routine she performed every day. Her posture stiffened as she crossed the aisle, positioning herself firmly in Zora's path. "Excuse me, ma'am," she began, her voice an oddly rehearsed combination of politeness and condescension. "This is first class, for paying customers only. You'll need to move." Zora felt her stomach tighten, though she didn't show it. She had been down this road before. "I'm in 2A, Zora responded softly, her voice calm, but carrying a quiet authority that only came from years of training in a world that didn't always expect her to belong. The flight attendant, whose name tag read Claire Brooks, gave a small, dismissive chuckle. "Oh, honey, it seems there's been a mix-up," she said, tilting her head as she glanced at the boarding pass Zora held out to her. "That seat is for Mr. Caldwell." Claire's eyes flickered over Zora's black dress and her well-polished shoes, her posture and her confidence clearly. This didn't match what she'd expected. Zora didn't flinch. "I have a confirmed first-class seat," she said again, raising her voice just enough to carry. "Seat 2A, paid upgrade. My boarding pass, as you can see, confirms this." Claire barely glanced at the boarding pass, her lips curling into a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Oh, honey, these mix-ups happen all the time," she said, almost as if Zora were a child. "Someone probably used your miles without your permission. Happens all the time. People trying to sneak into first class." Zora's fingers tightened around her leather briefcase. The leather felt smooth beneath her fingers, like the quiet force she was becoming. 2 decades of law practice had taught her the unspoken rules, the moments that would mark a turn in her life. This was one of those moments. She could feel the eyes of other passengers beginning to drift toward them, a hum of nervous energy in the air. Several people, unaware of the rising tension, were pulling out their phones, the modern reflex to document everything in real time. Zora didn't mind. Let them watch, let them record. What mattered was the resolution, not the spectacle. Behind her, the hum of the plane's interior mixed with the soft murmur of voices, and then the unmistakable sound of Elijah Walker tapping on his phone screen. He was a young man, an economics major at NYU, seated a few rows behind her. She saw his thumb hover over the Instagram Live button, and then heard his whispered voice. "Y'all need to see this," he murmured, his voice barely audible, though Zora could hear the undercurrent of urgency. "This is happening right now on Liberty Air Flight 509. This is insane!" Zora's heart beat steadily as the scene played out. The modern world was no longer just about individuals, it was about the crowd. It was about how fast things spread, how quick reactions could turn into movements. And she, Dr. Zora Kingston, knew how to play this game. Claire was still speaking, though Zora barely registered the words anymore. "Ma'am," Claire said again, her voice almost too sweet. "I need you to return to your assigned seat in economy. You're holding up our boarding process." The condescension in her voice rang clear now. Zora's grip on her briefcase tightened, but her posture remained as still as ever. A moment like this could feel like a battle or a strategic maneuver. Zora understood that every moment was a choice. She would not play into the role Claire had tried to assign her. "Let me make a quick call to clarify this situation," Zora said, her voice cutting through the rising tension. Her phone buzzed. A small text from her assistant flashed on the screen. "Reminder. Board meeting moved to 3 p.m. Senator Williams confirmed for 2:30. A slight breath of relief passed through her. She was still needed elsewhere, but first, this needed to be resolved. Before she could respond, Brad Morrison, the man sitting in 2A, finally spoke up. "Just take your real seat back there," he said, his voice dripping with entitlement, his body sprawling across the seat as if it were his personal domain. "Some of us actually paid for first class?" Zora could feel her jaw tighten, but she remained silent. She had seen this kind of thing before, hadn't she? The arrogance, the assumption, the presumption that he belonged there simply because he had money and, apparently, the right connections. This was not the first time someone had assumed she didn't belong. But this time would be different. Zora pulled out her boarding pass slowly, once again making sure the light from the phone illuminated it clearly. She held it out to Claire, who barely glanced at it. "Oh, honey," Claire said, her voice rising slightly in a tone meant to sound professional. "This mistake happens all the time. You should have seen the mess with my last flight. People trying to sneak in and use their miles." Elijah's phone buzzed. "We're up to 156 viewers," he muttered under his breath. And Zora, watching him, knew that this was no longer just a personal confrontation. It was becoming a spectacle, a moment for the public to witness what was happening. She raised her voice again, cutting through the noise. "I understand your confusion, but let me just make a quick call to clarify this," she said again, steadying her hands. Zora was always calm under pressure. Her 22 years of legal experience taught her that emotions, especially in times like these, were irrelevant. What mattered was how you handled the moment, how you controlled your response, not your reaction. "Ma'am," Claire interrupted, her smile more forced now, "I'm going to have to ask you to deplane if you continue to disrupt our boarding process." At that moment, Zora's phone buzzed again. Another text. The message was brief. "Senator Williams wants to know if we are still on track for the 2:30 meeting." She glanced at the screen for a second before locking her phone, her gaze returning to Claire, then to Brad. Her pulse remained steady. The standoff grew in silence. Just as Zora opened her briefcase, another voice came from behind her. "This is disgusting," someone muttered. It was a woman from row 3, standing now, trying to catch Zora's attention. "I saw her board with first-class passengers. Her ticket was legitimate. This is wrong." Claire's forced smile faltered for a moment, and in that moment, Zora saw an opening. She could feel the weight of every eye on her, every phone being pointed in her direction, every silent moment stretching the tension tighter. She would not let this stand. Zora Kingston was a woman who had always known how to move through worlds, how to maneuver through systems that had never been designed for people like her. And now, in this very moment, she would expose the cracks that lay beneath the surface of what seemed like a simple misunderstanding. She would make them see the force that lay beneath her composed surface. At that moment, she knew. This wasn't just about a seat. The tension in the air was palpable as Zora stood firm, the weight of the confrontation pressing in on her. Elijah's phone buzzed again, now showing over 300 live viewers. The silent watchers in the cabin, their phones trained on the scene, became more than passive witnesses. They were part of the spectacle unfolding. Every second that passed added another layer of weight to the situation. Zora, though, remained unmoved, her composure like the calm before a storm. Claire's voice faltered slightly, the authority in her tone cracking as more passengers began to murmur. She was losing control of the situation, but Zora had no intention of letting her regain it. Zora was not a woman who easily bowed to pressure. She had learned the art of waiting, of listening to the world unfold before taking the next step. And right now, she knew she was standing at the crossroads of something much bigger than a simple dispute over a seat. A few passengers exchanged uncomfortable glances. Zora could hear whispers from the rows behind her, people shifting in their seats. The realization seemed to ripple outward, like waves hitting the shore. The moment had shifted, no longer just about a seat or a boarding pass. It was about something deeper, something more insidious. Zora glanced down at her phone, where a notification from her assistant flashed across the screen. Reminder: the merger deadline is looming. Senator Williams has confirmed for 2:30. She read the message twice, grounding herself in the knowledge that the events here could have far-reaching consequences beyond just this flight, beyond the inconvenience of a delayed schedule. She could feel the familiar pull of strategy, the thrill of knowing that in this moment the power was in her hands. Claire Brooks's smugness was starting to slip. She was no longer standing tall with her usual confidence, her attempts to assert control now faltering under the weight of Zora's calm. The flight attendant's eyes darted around the cabin, looking for support, but the growing number of passengers taking out their phones was making her realize that the tide was turning. Zora Kingston was not going to be intimidated. "I think you may want to call your supervisor." Zora's voice was measured, unwavering. She was no longer speaking to Claire as if she were a passenger on this flight. She was speaking as a woman accustomed to power, accustomed to pushing systems to their breaking point. Claire's eyes flickered toward the front of the plane, and then back to Zora. "Fine," she said, clearly annoyed but also uncertain of what she had just unleashed. "I'll get someone who can help." Zora didn't need to raise her voice. She didn't need to escalate things any further. She stood there quietly, waiting for the inevitable appearance of a supervisor. In a strange way, she almost welcomed it. This wasn't about her right to sit in first class anymore. This was a reckoning. Minutes later, the door at the front of the cabin opened, and Antonio Morales, a gate agent, stepped through the aisle. He was young, no more than 25, and had the kind of nervous energy that suggested this was far outside his comfort zone. His uniform was freshly pressed, but his posture wasn't as sharp as it should have been. He didn't carry the weight of corporate authority. He carried the uncertainty of someone who had been called into a situation he didn't understand. Zora watched him closely, her gaze steady. She was already calculating. Antonio looked between her and the irritable Claire, who now stood with arms crossed, practically wringing her hands in frustration. "Ma'am, what seems to be the issue here?" Antonio asked, his voice almost too soft, unsure of how to proceed. Zora could tell he was trying to gauge the room, trying to decide whose side he should take. Zora didn't waste time with pleasantries. She took a step forward, her voice strong, confident. "There is no issue. My boarding pass shows seat 2A in first class. I've paid for it. I'm being told to move by your flight attendant, despite the fact that this is my assigned seat." Antonio glanced at the boarding pass Zora held, then down at his tablet, his brow furrowing. "Your boarding pass does show seat 2A, he said slowly, "but Mr. Caldwell has already checked in for that seat. It looks like there's been a system error." Zora's gaze sharpened. Mr. Caldwell. Zora had no need to ask who that was. The name was familiar. The man who had claimed her seat, who had spoken with such entitlement, was connected to the highest levels of Liberty Air. His family ran the airline. As if on cue, Zora's phone buzzed once again, a message from her assistant. "Charles Caldwell from Liberty Air's CEO office is calling. I'll let it go to voicemail unless you want to answer." She hesitated for only a moment before pressing the green button to accept the call. The voice on the other end was unmistakable. "Dr. Kingston," Charles Caldwell's voice came through, his tone smooth, but there was an edge to it that she didn't miss. "I've just been briefed on the situation at Gate A12. Zora didn't miss a beat. "And what, Mr. Caldwell, exactly do you plan to do about it?" She could feel the weight of her words. This wasn't a casual conversation. This was not just a woman trying to reclaim her seat. This was a woman standing up for something larger than just herself. She could hear the slight crackle of static through the phone line as Charles Caldwell exhaled sharply. "I'll have to speak with my staff and make sure this doesn't happen again." His words were vague, but Zora heard the underlying discomfort in his voice. He knew the gravity of the situation was slipping out of his control. "It's not enough, Mr. Caldwell," Zora said, her voice low but firm. "I've been discriminated against, not just here but repeatedly by your staff. You need to address the systemic issue that's been allowed to run rampant in your company, and I'm not walking away without accountability." The tension grew thicker as Zora's words hung in the air. Zora's mind raced. She had known that Liberty Air was a company with significant flaws. But now, she had leverage. Her firm, Kingston and Associates, held sway with some of the largest institutional investors in the country, and she knew that she could use this moment to not only make things right for herself, but to demand real, lasting change. Liberty Air was not prepared for this fight. But as Zora continued to stand there, she couldn't shake the feeling that the battle was far from over. This wasn't just about her seat on this plane. The gate area fell into an almost oppressive silence as Zora stood tall, her fingers clutching her leather briefcase with quiet resolve. The weight of her own presence had shifted the atmosphere completely. Passengers now sat at the edge of their seats, eyes fixed on the unfolding drama, their phones still recording. The sharp edge of the tension was palpable. This was no longer just a flight dispute. It was a showdown, a defining moment. The phone call with Charles Caldwell had rattled the veneer of calm that had enveloped Liberty Air. He had tried to downplay the situation. But Zora wasn't fooled. She knew his words were hollow, nothing more than an attempt to stave off a storm he couldn't control. But she could feel it now. The growing pressure, the rising tide of public scrutiny, and the weight of her legal expertise bearing down on them. A faint click echoed through the quiet cabin, the sound of Zora's phone locking as she slid it into her pocket. Her gaze remained fixed on the agent in front of her, Antonio Morales, who was clearly out of his depth. He shifted uneasily, his brow furrowing as he glanced between her and the increasingly tense passengers. She could see him calculating, trying to gauge how to handle the situation, knowing that his every move was being observed, recorded, and evaluated by not just the passengers, but by the larger public now watching through social media. "I'll call my supervisor," Antonio said, his voice uncertain but formal, as if he was trying to regain control. Zora could hear the soft murmurs around her, passengers whispering about the scene, but none dared speak too loudly. She could feel their collective gaze, some with curiosity, others with quiet support. It was a weight she was familiar with. The power of being watched, of becoming an unwilling symbol of something larger than herself. Zora gave a small nod, though she didn't move from her spot. She wasn't going to let this slide, not this time. She had been too quiet for too long, too passive. And today, standing in front of a nearly full flight of people, she realized she wasn't just fighting for her own dignity anymore. She was fighting for every person who had ever been ignored or dismissed because of their race, their gender, or their background. Antonio left to make the call, and Zora turned slightly, glancing toward the back of the plane. Elijah Walker, the young economics student, was still holding his phone up, the live stream now capturing the growing crowd of digital witnesses. The count was over 1,500 viewers, a number that seemed to climb by the second. Zora could feel the pressure shift again. She wasn't just a passenger now. She was part of a larger movement. Her thoughts were interrupted when Grace Harper, the investigative journalist sitting a few rows back, stood up and approached Zora. Grace had been quiet up until this point, observing the scene with a professional detachment that suggested she knew how to stay neutral in a room full of uncertainty. But now, there was a fire in her eyes, a recognition of the injustice unfolding before her. "Dr. Kingston," Grace said softly, her voice low but clear. "I've been covering stories like this for years, but I've never seen anything quite like this. You're not just standing up for yourself, you're standing up for everyone who's ever been pushed aside because of their background. What you're doing here, it's going to change things." Zora's gaze shifted to Grace, and for a moment their eyes met. It was a moment of mutual understanding. Grace wasn't just a bystander anymore. She was an ally. She wasn't just watching a story unfold, she was witnessing the beginning of something bigger. Zora felt a sense of solidarity, a small but powerful acknowledgement that there were people who understood. But the moment was fleeting. Zora's attention snapped back to the front of the plane as the assistant manager, Derek Walsh, appeared at the entrance of the cabin. His professional demeanor didn't match the unease that was clearly visible on his face. Zora could see the tension in his jaw, the hesitation in his steps. This wasn't just a minor seating issue anymore. The stakes had shifted, and he knew it. "Dr. Kingston," Derek said, his voice smooth but lacking the usual confidence that came with a position of authority. "I understand there's been some confusion here. Let me assure you, we're handling the situation. But I do ask that you return to your seat in economy. We need to ensure a timely departure." Zora could feel her pulse quicken as she took in his words. He was trying to diffuse the situation, to minimize the problem. He was trying to downplay it as something that could be resolved with a simple request, a little apology, and some concessions. But Zora knew better. "I'm not going anywhere until this is addressed properly," Zora replied, her voice cold but unwavering. She didn't raise it, didn't need to. The authority in her words was all that was needed. "I've paid for this seat, and I'm not about to be pushed into the back of the plane like I don't belong here. Your staff, Mr. Walsh, needs to be held accountable for this." Derek's face stiffened, and for a moment he said nothing. Zora knew that he was calculating how much he could get away with, how much power he had left to try and control the narrative. But in this moment, he had none. The plane was alive with digital witnesses, every word being captured, every gesture recorded. The game had changed. "Dr. Kingston, I'll need to call corporate." Derek's voice was more resigned now, the weight of the situation settling on him. He stepped back, pulling out his phone, his fingers moving quickly as he dialed. Zora didn't move. She didn't need to. As she stood there, holding her ground, Zora felt a deep, unwavering sense of purpose. This wasn't just about the seat. This wasn't just about the petty conflict with a flight attendant, or the frustrating moment of being questioned by a man who assumed his company's power could shut her down. This was about exposing the deep rot in the system, about calling out the culture of corporate negligence that allowed for this kind of behavior. And it was about time someone stood up and made them see it. Zora's phone buzzed again, and her assistant's name flashed across the screen. She declined the call, but knew that this could no longer be put off. The merger deadline was coming, and this situation was quickly becoming more than just a personal fight. It was a test of the corporate world's ability to acknowledge its wrongs. The phone call was brief, but its implications were immediate. As soon as Zora heard Charles Caldwell's voice, she knew the stakes had just escalated. He didn't waste time with pleasantries. "Dr. Kingston, I've just been briefed on the situation at Gate A12. I want to personally apologize for any inconvenience you've experienced." The forced politeness in his voice was clear, but so was the tension. Zora's grip on the armrest tightened. She could hear the weight of his words, feel the calculated corporate attempt to smooth things over, but she wasn't interested in apologies. She had heard enough empty words in her career to recognize when they were being used as a shield. "Mr. Caldwell." Zora's voice was calm but firm, cutting through his rehearsed lines. "An apology is a start, but it's far from enough. This is about more than just my seat. This is about a systemic issue that's been allowed to continue unchecked in your company." Zora's words hung in the air, heavy with the weight of truth. The silence on the other end of the line was telling. She could feel him squirming, even from miles away. "I understand," he finally said, his voice less confident now. "I'll have my team look into it, but we can't let this delay our flight." Zora exhaled slowly, a smile tugging at the corners of her lips. "Mr. Caldwell, if you think a delayed flight is the issue here, then you've misunderstood entirely. The issue is that Liberty Air has fostered an environment where people like me are treated as if we don't belong in places we've earned the right to be. And I'm not going to let that slide." With those words, Zora hung up the phone, knowing she had just tipped the balance. The fight wasn't just hers anymore. The digital witnesses Elijah's live stream, Grace's journalistic instincts, and the growing awareness of every passenger had turned this moment into something far bigger than a seating dispute. Zora wasn't just claiming her seat on this flight. She was making a stand that would ripple out far beyond this plane. Antonio Morales returned to the gate, looking more unsettled than before. He was carrying the weight of a decision that had already been made, even if no one had openly acknowledged it. The murmurs in the cabin grew louder as the passengers began to realize the gravity of the situation. Zora's resolve had turned this from a personal inconvenience into a corporate crisis. "Dr. Kingston," Antonio said quietly, but Zora could hear the hesitation in his voice. "I spoke with corporate, and they've agreed to honor your seating. But we need you to return to your seat for the sake of the other passengers." His words, though polite, were empty. She could see right through them. It wasn't about the passengers anymore. It was about Liberty Air saving face. Zora stood tall, the embodiment of quiet dignity. She wasn't here to make noise for the sake of it. She was here to expose what had been hidden for far too long. She gave a single nod, acknowledging Antonio, but her mind was already focused on the larger picture. She wasn't backing down. Not now, not ever. "I will return to my seat, Antonio, but don't think for a second this is over." Zora's voice was low, but the certainty in it rang out clear to anyone who was listening. She wasn't just going to accept this moment. She was going to make sure it became a turning point. As she turned toward her seat, Elijah Walker's phone buzzed again, and Zora could see the number of viewers climbing steadily. 4,000, 5,000. The digital platform had become a stage, and Zora had become the lead actor. But the crowd, though silent, was no longer merely an audience. They were participants in the unfolding drama. Every time someone shared the live stream, it spread further, gaining momentum. This wasn't just about a seat in first class anymore. It was about a corporate culture that needed to be reformed. Zora made her way down the aisle, but before she could sit down, Grace Harper approached her again, her eyes sharp with focus. The journalist had been documenting everything, but Zora knew her intentions weren't just about a story. They were about the truth. "Dr. Kingston," Grace began, her voice barely above a whisper. "I've been following stories of corporate corruption and discrimination for years. But what's happening here? This isn't just a single incident. This is systemic. You're not just fighting for yourself. You're fighting for everyone who's been overlooked or dismissed." Zora met her gaze, a small but determined smile crossing her face. "I've been fighting this fight for a long time, Grace, but you're right. This isn't just about me. It's about all of us." Zora turned back to her seat, but the weight of her words lingered in the air. It was as if she was speaking not just to Grace, but to every passenger on the flight, to every person who had ever faced discrimination and remained silent. They were listening now. They were all a part of this moment. As she settled into her seat, the hum of the plane filled the cabin. But it was different now. The air felt thicker, charged with the electricity of a truth that could no longer be ignored. Zora's phone buzzed again. This time the screen flashed a new notification. Senator Williams had reached out. The moment had arrived. The moment the plane's engines began to hum louder, as if signaling that it was finally ready to take off, Zora felt a strange sense of calm wash over her. She had done what she needed to do. Her seat was confirmed, her presence asserted, and the corporate system that had tried to crush her dignity was now on notice. As the flight attendant moved through the aisle with her usual robotic motions, Zora felt the weight of the moment settle deeper into her bones. This wasn't just another legal battle. This was a confrontation of power, privilege, and resistance. The overhead bins closed with a final thud, and the flight attendants began their safety demonstration, their words barely registering in Zora's mind. Instead, her thoughts circled around the tension that still hung in the cabin, the quiet simmering of passengers who had been watching every move. Her body was still, but her mind was working overtime, thinking of the larger implications of what had just unfolded. Elijah Walker's livestream had reached a new high, over 6,000 viewers now. His face had appeared on Zora's phone just moments ago, his eyes wide with a mixture of excitement and disbelief as the digital numbers climbed. He had been a quiet ally until now, but his involvement was more than just passive observation. Elijah had become the conduit for a message that needed to be heard, that this fight was bigger than one seat, one flight, or even one airline. Zora glanced around the cabin, her gaze sweeping over the passengers who had once only been background noise. Some were still recording, others were whispering to each other. The quiet had turned into something much louder now, the sound of a story spreading beyond the confines of the plane, reaching into the lives of those who weren't even on board. But Zora knew better than to get distracted by the growing digital storm. She still had work to do. The real challenge was ahead of her. She could feel it deep within her, an uncomfortable but undeniable certainty that this confrontation wasn't the end. It was just the beginning. Grace Harper, now seated across from Zora, leaned forward slightly, her eyes reflecting the deep concentration of a seasoned journalist. She had been silent for the past few minutes, probably processing what she had just witnessed, but Zora could see the recognition in her gaze. Grace was no longer just a passive observer. She had seen enough to know what this meant. She was already calculating the story in her head. "You're playing a dangerous game, Dr. Kingston?" Grace said softly, her voice low but carrying the weight of her journalistic instincts. "This isn't just a story about discrimination anymore. This is a story about power, about corporate America trying to hide behind its own mistakes. I've covered a lot of stories, but this—" Her voice trailed off, as if the enormity of what they were dealing with was just starting to hit her. Zora nodded slowly. "I know what I'm doing, Grace. This isn't just about me. It's about everything that's been swept under the rug for so long." The hum of the plane grew louder as it began its ascent into the sky, but Zora's thoughts were still anchored firmly on the ground. She had felt the weight of the moment the second she stepped onto the plane, and as the minutes passed, she knew the ramifications of this incident would not fade quietly into the background. She was creating a ripple effect, a public spectacle that would not be ignored. The reality of what she had just done started to settle into her bones. She wasn't just fighting for justice in this moment. She was fighting for something that had been simmering under the surface for years. This was bigger than a single airline. It was bigger than a single CEO. It was about a system that needed to change. Zora had known for years that she would face this kind of challenge. She had been preparing for it without even realizing. The legal victories, the countless battles she had fought in boardrooms and courtrooms had all been leading up to this. But even she hadn't expected it to play out this way so suddenly, so in the open, and with such undeniable force. Zora's phone buzzed again, snapping her out of her thoughts. A new message from her assistant read, "Charles Caldwell has agreed to a meeting tomorrow at 10 a.m. He's ready to discuss the terms." Zora felt the flicker of a smile on her lips. This was the moment she had been waiting for. She had built a name for herself in the legal world, not just for her expertise, but for her ability to navigate through moments like this where the personal met the political, where the system's cracks were no longer easy to ignore. She had just cracked one of those cracks wide open. As the plane climbed higher, Zora turned her focus to the task at hand. There was more to be done. This was only the beginning of what she knew would be a long battle. The meeting with Charles Caldwell, the CEO of Liberty Air, was just the first step. The real challenge was going to be making sure the reforms that Zora demanded were not just words on a page, but real change that could withstand the weight of corporate interests. But Zora's resolve remained unshaken. She had seen these kinds of battles before. She had watched as corporations hid behind their shiny facades, pretending that their policies didn't carry consequences for the people they impacted. But she wasn't going to let Liberty Air get away with it. Not this time. The plane leveled off, the rhythmic thrum of the engines providing a steady backdrop to Zora's thoughts. She could feel the eyes of the passengers on her, some of them still recording, some of them just watching. In that moment, Zora realized something. She wasn't alone anymore. This fight had become theirs, too. Zora knew that there was power in numbers, power in the collective action of those who were willing to speak up, to act when it mattered. And today, it mattered. The sound of the seatbelt sign clicking off seemed to echo through the cabin as the plane steadied its course, the rhythm of the engines taking over once again. The tension from earlier still hung in the air, but it was now tempered with the quiet of anticipation. Zora sat back in her seat, her eyes fixed on the screen in front of her, but her thoughts were far from the in-flight entertainment. She had just set something in motion, something that had the potential to shift the balance of power in a way that few people, especially those in the corporate world, ever got the chance to do. The weight of her actions from earlier was still settling in, but she could feel something in her, an unshakable certainty that she was on the right path. She wasn't just fighting for a personal victory. She was fighting for every person who had been discriminated against, overlooked, or told they didn't belong in spaces they had every right to occupy. Zora had known she would have to face this kind of challenge at some point in her career, but she had never imagined it would come so unexpectedly, and certainly not on a flight bound for Washington, D.C. Her phone buzzed once more, snapping her out of her thoughts. The notification from her assistant was a reminder of the meeting with Senator Williams, scheduled for the following morning. "You have his full support," the message read. Zora's lips parted in a small smile, but there was no time to bask in the fleeting satisfaction. The real work was ahead of her. As the hours passed and the plane's altitude stabilized, Zora allowed herself a few moments to reflect. The fight she was waging was bigger than just this moment. It was bigger than Liberty Air. She had watched corporate entities bury their flaws behind polished facades for years, but now the cracks were starting to show. She had pushed those cracks open wider, and now the corporate world would have to reckon with them. This wasn't just about a single airline. This was about systemic change. Her thoughts were interrupted when Grace Harper stood up, her presence cutting through Zora's internal monologue. Grace had been observing silently for most of the flight, but now she moved toward Zora with purpose. Her determination was palpable. Grace was no longer just the journalist documenting a story. She was part of it, and her role in this unfolding drama was becoming clearer by the minute. "Dr. Kingston," Grace began, her voice low but urgent, "I've been covering stories of corporate corruption and systemic injustice for years, but this is something else. What you did back there, it's more than just standing up for your seat. It's about exposing the rot within these organizations. This story, it's not just a one-time incident. It's the tip of the iceberg." Zora turned toward Grace, her gaze steady. "I've known this fight for a long time," Zora said, her voice calm, but with an edge of resolve that only those who truly understood the weight of such battles could recognize. "And I'm not going to let it be swept under the rug any longer." Grace nodded, taking a step back, clearly absorbing the weight of Zora's words. There was a moment of silence between them, but it wasn't uncomfortable. It was a recognition of shared purpose. Grace knew what was at stake, and in her own way, she was ready to be a part of this larger fight. She wasn't just reporting it anymore. She was helping write it. As the plane continued its flight, the sun began to set outside the window, casting a warm glow across the cabin. Zora glanced out at the horizon, the sprawling view of the American landscape beneath her. The stark contrast between the peaceful scenery and the intensity of what she had just started made her feel almost detached from the present moment. But she couldn't afford to be distracted. The door to the cockpit opened as the captain emerged, his demeanor calm but clearly aware of the weight of the situation. Captain Samuel Hayes had been one of the few people to not take sides when the conflict had unfolded. Instead of blindly siding with the flight attendants or trying to suppress the issue, he had remained neutral. Zora knew he had the authority to defuse the situation if he chose to, but he had done the right thing. He had allowed her to speak her truth, and that meant something. "Dr. Kingston," Captain Hayes said, his voice sincere, "I want to personally apologize for what happened earlier. It was a mistake on our part, and I'm deeply sorry that you had to go through that." Zora glanced at him, a flicker of appreciation passing through her eyes. "Thank you, Captain," she said softly. "But it's not just about this incident. It's about creating a system where things like this don't happen in the first place." Captain Hayes nodded solemnly, his eyes narrowing as he processed Zora's words. "I completely understand," he replied. "I'll make sure we take this up with corporate." Zora nodded back at him, but she knew the real work wasn't in their apology. It was in the actions that would follow. It was in the changes they would have to make to prevent this from happening again. The plane began its descent, signaling the end of the flight. Zora's mind was already on the next steps. The meeting with Senator Williams would be pivotal. It wasn't just about pushing Liberty Air to make reforms, it was about setting a precedent. If this fight could be won, others would follow. Other companies would have to follow suit, or they would face the same scrutiny. The plane touched down smoothly, and the seatbelt sign flickered back on. As the aircraft taxied toward the gate, Zora felt a sense of determination rise within her. She wasn't just a passenger on this flight. She was a force in a larger movement, one that was about to reshape the way corporations dealt with power and privilege. As the plane came to a stop, the captain's voice came over the intercom, announcing their arrival. Zora's phone buzzed again, and she reached for it without hesitation. A new message from her assistant. "Charles Caldwell has agreed to meet tomorrow at 10 a.m. He's ready to discuss terms, but he's requesting a private meeting." Zora's fingers tightened around her phone. This was it. This was the moment. Zora Kingston had never imagined that her moment of quiet resistance would reach so many, nor that it would become a beacon for change. But the journey from that first confrontation standing in the aisle of a crowded airplane, fighting for a seat she had earned to the culmination of her actions, was more than a simple battle over personal dignity. It was a fight for something much bigger, for the quiet strength that often goes unnoticed in a world that is too quick to dismiss and overlook. At first, it was a moment of personal injustice, a seat in first class, a place that was supposed to be her right, taken away from her without cause or explanation. It was the quiet condescension of the flight attendant, the dismissive gestures, the assumption that Zora didn't belong simply because of who she was. But it wasn't just that one moment. It was every instance of subtle bias she had endured throughout her life, the times when she was overlooked, dismissed, or forced to prove her worth in ways that others never had to. Yet, Zora's response was not born out of anger or rage. She didn't raise her voice in fury, though there was plenty to be angry about. Instead, she stood with the kind of quiet resilience that comes from knowing that, when faced with prejudice, the only way forward is to stand your ground, calm, collected, unwavering. She didn't have to shout or demand respect. She simply demanded the right to be heard, to be treated with the dignity every human being deserves. That quiet strength, so often undervalued, became Zora's weapon. It was her calmness that turned the tide, her refusal to be intimidated that exposed the cracks in Liberty Air's polished facade. And when she stood up, not just for her seat, but for every person who had ever been told they didn't belong, it was more than a victory in that moment. It became a statement, a message to everyone watching that no injustice is too small to confront, that no system is too powerful to be challenged. But the battle was not fought alone. It was the support of those who saw the truth of the situation and chose to act, like Elijah Walker, the young student whose phone recorded the injustice and made it impossible for anyone to ignore, and Grace Harper, the journalist who understood the larger significance of what was unfolding and chose to use her platform to amplify the fight for justice. It was Antonio Morales, the gate agent caught between his duty and the moral choice of standing by what was right. Together they showed what real allyship looks like. They didn't remain passive. They chose to be part of something greater than themselves, to stand up when others might have turned a blind eye. In the end, Zora did not just reclaim her seat on a plane. She reclaimed her dignity, and with it, she exposed the systemic bias that too often goes unchecked behind the closed doors of corporate America. She made it clear that the policies that are crafted to protect an institution, to preserve its pristine image, mean nothing without the respect for the human beings those policies are supposed to serve. The real change, however, would come not just from the public apology from Liberty Air's CEO, nor from the corporate pledges that followed. It would come from the recognition that policy without respect is hollow. It is only when people are treated as equal, when they are truly seen for who they are, that systems can claim to be just. Zora knew that true change would come slowly, that the fight for dignity would not be over in one meeting or one press release. But it was a beginning, and that was enough. It takes immense courage to confront not just an individual, but an entire system. Zora's courage was not about a loud outcry, nor was it about violent resistance. It was about standing up, quiet yet forceful, and demanding that the world recognize the simple truth, that every person has a right to be treated with dignity, no matter their background, their color, or their place in life. Zora's actions set a powerful example. The difference between compliance with prejudice and the fight for fairness is the difference between silent submission and standing tall. And as she stepped off that plane, knowing she had made a mark, she understood this was only the beginning. The truth had been spoken, and the path to justice was now clearer than ever. The philosophy remains. Real change happens when we choose to confront injustice, not with anger, but with the quiet strength of knowing our worth. If you found this story inspiring, if you believe in the power of standing up against injustice, leave a 1 in the comments. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel to hear the next story, where the fight for justice continues. Together, we can make a difference.